This is happening right now in Jerusalem. The ancient stones of the old city shimmered under the morning sun, but something was different. The usual bustling sounds of merchants calling out their wares, tourists chattering in dozens of languages, and the rhythmic footsteps of pilgrims walking the Via Dolorosa had all ceased. An extraordinary silence had fallen over the holy city. The streets went silent. People left their work and looked up at the sky. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores, cell phones forgotten in their hands. Even the hardened journalists who had covered conflicts in this region for decades found themselves without words. Rabbi David Goldstein was preparing for morning prayers at the Western Wall when he first noticed it. The usual morning crowd of worshippers had grown unusually quiet. Instead of the typical murmur of individual prayers, there was an almost reverent hush that seemed to blanket the entire plaza. "I've been coming to this wall for 30 years, Rabbi Goldstein would later tell reporters. "I've never experienced anything like this morning. It was as if the very stones were holding their breath." The mainstream media isn't covering this the way they should. They're calling it a moment of unusual quiet or an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon. But those who were there, those who felt it in their spirit, know this was something far more significant. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an archaeologist from Oxford who had been working on excavations near the Temple Mount, was taking her morning coffee when the silence descended. "I stepped outside my hotel, and it was like the entire city had been placed under a glass dome," she described. "No wind, no sound, just this incredible sense of expectation. The same soil where prophets walked, the same streets that heard the Messiah's footsteps. And on this particular morning, it felt as though the weight of thousands of years of prayer and prophecy was pressing down on every soul in the city." Father Antonio Rodriguez, a Catholic priest visiting from Spain, was leading a small group of pilgrims through the Garden of Gethsemane when the phenomenon occurred. "We were reading from the Gospel of Matthew when suddenly everyone stopped talking. It wasn't that we chose to stop, it was as if speech itself had been gently taken from us. We stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, just listening to what he couldn't say. But every person in that garden and throughout Jerusalem seemed to be hearing something beyond the range of human ears. You're watching this because God wanted you to see it. Something in your spirit recognizes this moment as different, doesn't it? This isn't coincidence. This is prophecy in motion." The silence lasted exactly 7 minutes. When the normal sounds of the city gradually returned, they seemed somehow softer, more reverent. People moved more slowly, spoke more quietly, as if the morning's experience had left an invisible mark on their souls. And when I tell you what happened next, you'll understand what's truly unfolding in these final moments of history. My friend, can you feel this in your spirit? What happened that morning was just the beginning. Today, something impossible appeared in the workshops beneath Jerusalem's old city. The ancient chambers that had been sealed for generations were suddenly alive with purpose. Deep beneath the stone streets where tourists walk, in spaces that haven't seen human activity for centuries, the sound of careful, reverent work could be heard. They don't want you to see what's really happening down there, but the truth can't stay hidden forever. Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen, one of the leading experts on temple service and biblical archaeology, had been working quietly for months with a small group of dedicated craftsmen. These weren't ordinary artisans. These were men who had spent their entire lives studying the precise requirements given in Scripture for the sacred vessels of the temple. The workshop was lit only by oil lamps, casting dancing shadows on walls that seemed to whisper with ancient purpose. On wooden tables covered with linen cloths lay objects that hadn't been seen for nearly 2,000 years. Golden vessels shaped according to the exact specifications found in Exodus. Silver trumpets crafted to the measurements given to Moses, and vestments woven from materials that had taken years to source, according to biblical requirements. "Every thread has meaning," Rabbi Cohen explained to his small team of assistants. "Every measurement carries the weight of divine instruction. We are not creating decorations. We are preparing the tools through which heaven will touch earth." But it was the arrival of the red heifer that changed everything. For years, cattle ranchers in both Israel and Texas had been carefully breeding cattle in hopes of producing the perfect red heifer required for the purification rituals described in Numbers chapter 19. The requirements were extraordinarily specific: a cow that was completely red, without a single hair of any other color, and which had never been used for work. On the same morning that Jerusalem experienced its mysterious silence, a rancher in the hills outside the city made a discovery that would send shockwaves through religious communities worldwide. Among his small herd was a heifer that met every single biblical requirement. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a veterinarian and biblical scholar who had been consulted to examine the animal, could barely contain her amazement. "In all my years of studying these requirements, I never thought I would see a perfect specimen. But this heifer, it's as if it was designed according to the ancient texts." The examination took place in complete secrecy. Only a handful of religious authorities were present as the heifer was carefully inspected according to the precise requirements laid out in Scripture. Every hair was examined, every inch of skin was checked, and her work history was meticulously verified. "When we completed the examination," said Rabbi Abraham Stern, who had traveled from New York specifically for this moment, "there was this incredible sense that we weren't just looking at an animal. We were looking at a key that could unlock the next chapter of biblical prophecy." The prophets spoke of this moment thousands of years ago. In Numbers 19, Moses recorded the precise instructions for the red heifer sacrifice that would purify the people for temple service. Without this purification, no priest could serve in the temple. For 2 millennia, this had been impossible. But now, for the first time since the destruction of the Second Temple, all the requirements were finally being met. But it wasn't just the red heifer. In workshops across Jerusalem, other preparations were accelerating at an unprecedented pace. The Temple Institute, which had been working for decades to recreate the sacred vessels needed for temple service, announced that they had completed the final pieces of the high priest's breastplate, the same breastplate that contained 12 precious stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. "Each stone has been cut and polished according to the descriptions given in Exodus," explained Dr. Michael Thompson, a gemologist who had volunteered his expertise to the project. "The craftsmanship required is extraordinary. These aren't just beautiful stones. They're sacred instruments that were designed to facilitate communication between the high priest and the Almighty." Devout men from every nation under heaven were beginning to gather in Jerusalem, just as the prophet Joel had foretold. Phone calls and emails were flooding rabbinical offices from Jews around the world, all asking the same question: "Is it time? Should we come home?" My friend, do you realize we are witnessing what generations only dreamed of? The veil between heaven and earth is getting thinner, and the preparations that began in ancient times are reaching their fulfillment. What happened in those underground workshops was just the preparation. But what's coming next will shake the foundations of every religion on earth. Jerusalem stopped this morning for a reason no one can explain. At exactly 3:33 a.m. local time, something unprecedented occurred over the Temple Mount. It wasn't an earthquake, though the ground trembled. It wasn't thunder, though the sound could be heard from Bethlehem to Tel Aviv. It was something that defied every natural explanation. Even reporters had no words. The sound began as a low rumble, barely perceptible, like the deepest note of an organ played at the threshold of human hearing. But within moments, it had grown into something that seemed to come not from the sky, but from the very foundations of the earth itself. Rabbi Sarah Leibowitz was keeping an all-night vigil at the Western Wall when it began. "I was praying the midnight prayers when I felt it before I heard it," she would later describe. Or it was like the stones themselves were singing, not metaphorically, literally. The ancient stones were resonating with something beyond our world. Security cameras throughout the old city captured the moment when every person within a mile radius of the Temple Mount suddenly stopped whatever they were doing and turned toward the sacred site. Night shift workers, security guards, pilgrims keeping vigil, residents in nearby apartments, all of them, without exception, felt an irresistible pull to face the place where the temple once stood. Father Michael Augustino, an Italian priest who had been studying in Jerusalem for 6 months, was awakened in his monastery cell by what he initially thought was the sound of a massive choir. I stepped outside expecting to see hundreds of people singing, but the courtyard was empty, yet the sound continued, this incredible harmony that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it was what happened next that truly defied explanation. As the sound reached its crescendo, witnesses throughout Jerusalem reported seeing what appeared to be a column of light extending from the Temple Mount straight up into the heavens. Unlike any earthly light, this column seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat, growing brighter and dimmer in perfect synchronization. Dr. James Patterson, an astrophysicist visiting from MIT, happened to be staying at a hotel with a clear view of the Temple Mount. "I've studied atmospheric phenomena my entire career," he said. "This wasn't aurora, it wasn't lightning, it wasn't any kind of natural light emission I've ever encountered. The spectral analysis would have been fascinating, but honestly, I forgot all about my scientific training. I just stood there and wept." The light lasted for exactly 18 minutes, the same amount of time, biblical scholars would later note, that it takes to recite the complete Shema, Judaism's most sacred prayer. During those 18 minutes, something extraordinary happened throughout the city. People who had been strangers began speaking to each other as if they were old friends. Language barriers seemed to dissolve. A businessman from Japan found himself in deep conversation with an elderly Palestinian grandmother, both somehow understanding each other perfectly, despite speaking different languages. "It was like the day of Pentecost," observed Dr. Ruth Hendricks, a biblical scholar from Fuller Seminary who had been in Jerusalem researching first-century Christianity. People from every nation were suddenly able to communicate, just as the Book of Acts describes. The same spirit that moved in the upper room was moving again in Jerusalem. This isn't hysteria, this is prophecy in motion. What the prophets saw thousands of years ago is unfolding before our eyes. In Zechariah 8:23, the prophet wrote, "In those days 10 men from every nation and language will take hold of one Jew by the hem of his garment and say, 'Let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you.'" That night, as news of the Jerusalem phenomenon spread across social media and international news networks, something unprecedented began happening in Jewish communities around the world. Gentiles, Christians, Muslims, people of no particular faith began reaching out to Jewish friends, neighbors, and even strangers, asking to accompany them on journeys to Jerusalem. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing," said Rabbi David Rosenberg of Beth Shalom congregation in New York. "People I've never met are calling, asking if they can travel with our next group to Jerusalem. They can't explain why, but they feel this overwhelming need to be there, to be part of whatever is happening." The same phenomenon was reported from London, Paris, Buenos Aires, Sydney, and dozens of other cities. Travel agencies specializing in religious pilgrimages found themselves overwhelmed with booking requests. Airlines began adding extra flights to Tel Aviv to accommodate the unexpected surge in demand. But perhaps most significantly, Jewish communities that had maintained their traditions in exile for 2 millennia began receiving inquiries about the rebuilding of the temple. Rabbinical schools found themselves fielding questions about temple service that hadn't been asked since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Young men are asking about the requirements for priestly service. reported Rabbi Isaac Goldberg of the Jerusalem Center for Biblical Studies. Families are researching their genealogies to determine if they carry the priestly line. It's as if an entire generation is suddenly awakening to their calling. And in the workshops beneath Jerusalem, the work continued with renewed urgency. The sacred vessels were nearly complete. The vestments had been finished. The red heifer awaited the moment of its purpose. My friend, can you feel this in your spirit? Do you realize we are witnessing what generations only dreamed of? God is moving the pieces of the end times, and every day brings us closer to the moment when heaven and earth will meet again on the Temple Mount. What happened that night stopped a city, but what's coming will stop the entire world. What happened today will be remembered as the day everything changed. The morning dawned crystal clear over Jerusalem, but those who had been watching and waiting knew this was no ordinary sunrise. For months, the signs had been building: the mysterious silence, the discovery of the perfect red heifer, the sound that had echoed across the holy city, and now, the moment that thousands of years of prophecy had been pointing toward. The streets of the old city were filled with people from every nation under heaven. They had come from Australia and Argentina, from Nigeria and Norway, from every corner of the earth. Jews returning to their ancient homeland, Christians seeking to witness biblical prophecy fulfilled, and countless others who simply felt an inexplicable calling to be present in Jerusalem on this day. People left their work and looked up at the sky, but this time they were not looking at an empty heaven. This time, something was looking back. Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen stood at the edge of the Temple Mount, wearing the recreated vestments of the high priest. The breastplate with its 12 precious stones caught the morning light, each gem seeming to glow with an inner fire. In his hands, he held the golden censer that had been crafted according to the precise specifications given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Beside him stood representatives of the priestly families that had maintained their lineage through 2 millennia of exile. They wore the white linen garments described in Leviticus, each thread woven according to ancient requirements, each garment consecrated through months of prayer and preparation. "I've dreamed of this moment my entire life," Rabbi Cohen said quietly to the small group of religious leaders gathered around him. "My father dreamed of it, and his father before him. For 70 generations we have kept the knowledge alive, waiting for the day when the temple service could be restored." The mainstream media had finally taken notice, but they still didn't understand what they were witnessing. News crews from around the world had gathered in Jerusalem, their cameras focused on what they were calling an unusual religious ceremony. But those who had eyes to see knew this was far more than ceremony. This was the restoration of the bridge between heaven and earth. At precisely noon, as the sun reached its zenith over the holy city, Rabbi Cohen began the purification ritual that hadn't been performed for nearly 2,000 years. The red heifer, perfect in every requirement of Scripture, had been prepared according to the instructions given in Numbers 19. But as the ceremony began, something unprecedented occurred. The light that had been seen over the Temple Mount weeks earlier suddenly returned, but this time it was different. Instead of a column reaching toward heaven, the light began to descend, slowly, gently, like the glory cloud that had filled Solomon's temple at its dedication. "Look!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Look at the sky!" Those present would later struggle to describe what they witnessed. The descending light seemed to carry within it the sound of countless voices singing in perfect harmony. Not human voices, but something infinitely more beautiful, more pure, more powerful than any earthly choir. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the archaeologist who had first experienced the mysterious silence weeks earlier, found herself weeping as she watched the light settle over the ancient foundation stones. "I've spent my career studying the past," she said, "but I suddenly realized I was witnessing the future. This wasn't just history repeating itself, this was history reaching its fulfillment." As the light touched the Temple Mount, something extraordinary happened throughout Jerusalem. The sick found themselves healed. The blind could see. The lame walked. It was as if the very presence of the divine was restoring creation itself. Father Antonio Rodriguez, the Spanish priest who had been present during the first silence, approached one of the Jewish religious leaders with tears streaming down his face. "Rabbi," he said, "I think I finally understand. This isn't about one religion or another. This is about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob calling all his children home." The rabbi embraced him warmly. "Welcome home, my brother." Similar scenes were playing out throughout the city. Ancient divisions seemed to dissolve in the presence of something greater than human understanding. Christians, Jews, and Muslims found themselves standing together, not in compromise of their beliefs, but in recognition of the one true God who was making himself known in Jerusalem. You're watching this because God wanted you to see it. Something in your spirit recognizes this moment as different. This is the preview of the greatest event in human history. As the afternoon wore on, reports began flooding in from around the world. In synagogues from New York to Moscow, the eternal flames that had burned for centuries suddenly blazed brighter. In churches from London to Lagos, stained glass windows that had been dark for decades began to glow with inexplicable light. In every place where faithful people had gathered to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, the presence of the divine was making itself known. But it was the testimony of one small child that perhaps captured the magnitude of what had occurred. 8-year-old Miriam Goldstein, daughter of Rabbi David Goldstein, who had experienced the first silence at the Western Wall, had been born deaf. As the light descended over the Temple Mount, her parents noticed her suddenly turning her head toward sounds she had never been able to hear. "Oh, Mommy," she said in a clear, strong voice that her parents had never heard before, "do you hear the angels singing?" Her first words, after 8 years of silence, were about the heavenly chorus that filled Jerusalem that day. As the sun set over the holy city, the light gradually faded, but its effects remained. Jerusalem had been transformed, not just the physical city, but the spiritual reality that had been restored in that place. Rabbi Cohen, still wearing the high priest's vestments, stood before the gathered crowd as darkness fell. In his hands, he held an ancient ram's horn that had been crafted from the horn of a ram that had grazed on the hills around Jerusalem. "For 2,000 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent plaza, "we have ended our prayers with the words, 'Next year in Jerusalem.' Tonight, we are here. Tonight, the presence of the Almighty has returned to dwell among his people." He lifted the shofar to his lips and blew a long, clear note that echoed off the ancient stones and seemed to carry all the way to heaven itself. The sound was picked up by shofars being blown in Jewish communities around the world. From New York to Moscow, from Buenos Aires to Melbourne, the call went out. The Lord has returned to Zion. The temple service has been restored. The long exile is over. My friend, what happened today was just the beginning. Now that you know this, what will you do about it? Are you ready for what comes next? While the world sleeps, God is calling those who are awake. The same God who spoke through the prophets, who walked among us in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, has returned to his holy mountain. This isn't the end of the story. This is the beginning of the greatest chapter in human history. What happened today stopped the world, but what's coming next will transform it forever. Until then, stay ready, stay faithful, Maranatha. The King is coming home.